Picture this, August 480 BC. A 60-year-old king stands at a narrow mountain pass, watching the dust clouds of the largest army the world has ever seen approaching from the north. His name is Leonidas. You know his name. Everyone knows his name. But everything you think you know about him is wrong. Not because the story isn't true, but because we've been telling ourselves the wrong story for over 2,000 years. We turned a complicated, messy, politically calculated military decision into a fairy tale about 300 warriors who chose death over dishonor. And in doing so, we erased the 7,000 other men who stood beside them. We erased the slaves. We erased the political intrigue. We erased the prophecy that might have been fabricated after the fact. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the truth is so much more powerful than the myth, and why Leonidas himself would probably hate what we've done to his legacy. Let me start by telling you who Leonidas actually was, because the movies got almost everything wrong. Leonidas wasn't supposed to be king. He was the third son of King Anaxandridas II, born around 540 BC in Sparta. According to Herodotus, our primary source for this entire story, his mother was not only his father's wife but also his father's niece, and she'd been barren for so long that Sparta's ruling council, the Ephors, tried to force the king to divorce her. Anaxandridas refused. The Ephors compromised. He could take a second wife without divorcing the first. That second wife gave birth to Cleomenes, who would become king first. Then suddenly, miraculously, Leonidas's mother became pregnant. First with Dorius, then with Leonidas, and finally with Cleombrotus. Think about what this means. Leonidas grew up as a spare to a spare. He wasn't raised in the palace with private tutors and royal privileges. Because he wasn't the heir, he was thrown into the agoge, Sparta's brutal military training system where boys were taken from their mothers at age 7 and subjected to years of deprivation, violence, and survival training. This wasn't a gift. It was abandonment dressed up as education. But it meant that unlike his older brothers, Leonidas knew exactly what it felt like to be a regular Spartan soldier. He'd been beaten, starved, and forced to steal food to survive. He'd killed other boys in training exercises. He'd learned that retreat meant death, that weakness meant death, that everything meant death. And then, through a series of political disasters and suspicious deaths, he became king at nearly 50 years old. His older brother Cleomenes died under mysterious circumstances, possibly suicide, possibly murdered by his own family. Dorius died trying to found a colony in Sicily. Suddenly, the spare to the spare was ruling one of the most powerful city-states in Greece. He'd been king for only 11 years when the Persians came. Here's what the movies don't tell you about Thermopylae: Leonidas didn't want to be there. No, seriously. Listen to this. In 480 BC, when scouts brought news that Xerxes I of Persia was marching toward Greece with an army that ancient sources claimed was over 1 million men, modern historians estimate between 120,000 and 300,000, the Greek city-states were panicking. A decade earlier, the Persians had invaded Greece and been defeated at Marathon. Now they were back, and this time they'd brought enough soldiers to blot out the sun. The Greek states held an emergency conference. Athens wanted to fight. Sparta? Well, Sparta had a problem. It was the Carnea, one of the most sacred festivals in the Spartan religious calendar. A 9-day celebration dedicated to Apollo. During the Carnea, Spartan law absolutely forbade any military activity. It was the same religious festival that had made them arrive too late to help Athens at the Battle of Marathon 10 years earlier, and the Athenians had never forgiven them for it. At the same time, the Olympic Games were happening. another sacred period where warfare was supposed to cease across all of Greece. So Sparta was stuck. They couldn't send their full army without committing double sacrilege. But if they didn't send anyone, they'd lose all credibility as the military leaders of the Greek alliance. They'd look like cowards, traitors even. The Ephors came up with a compromise that was equal parts political genius and moral cowardice. They'd send an advance guard under one of their two kings. A small force that could hold the Persians at a strategic choke point while looking like they were taking action, buying time until the festivals ended and the full Spartan army could march north. They chose Leonidas to lead this advance guard. And they gave him exactly 300 men. 300. Against hundreds of thousands. Now, according to Herodotus, Leonidas took only Spartiates, full Spartan citizens, who had living sons. The ancient historian claims this was because Leonidas knew they were marching to their deaths, and he wanted to make sure their family lines would continue. But modern scholars have a different theory. Leonidas took men with sons because these were the only warriors the Ephors would allow him to take. Men whose deaths wouldn't end their bloodlines. Expendable fathers. Leonidas wasn't leading a heroic suicide mission. He was leading a political sacrificial offering. Before Leonidas marched north, he did something interesting. He consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle was the most powerful religious institution in ancient Greece. A priestess who sat in an underground chamber beneath the temple of Apollo, breathing psychotropic vapors from a crack in the earth, speaking prophecies that shaped the fate of nations. Kings traveled from across the known world to hear what the gods had to say about their futures. And according to Herodotus, the oracle told Leonidas this: "For you, inhabitants of wide-wayed Sparta, either your great and glorious city must be wasted by Persian men, or if not that, then the bound of Lacedaemon must mourn a dead king, from Heracles' line. The might of bulls or lions will not restrain him with opposing strength, for he has the power of Zeus. I declare that he will not be restrained until he utterly tears apart one of these." In other words, either Sparta falls, or a Spartan king dies. This prophecy has been repeated for over 2 millennia as proof of Leonidas's incredible bravery and self-sacrifice. He knew he would die. He accepted his fate. He marched to Thermopylae understanding that his death would save his city. Except here's the problem. Modern historians aren't sure the prophecy is real. A 2020 academic paper examining the Delphic oracle and Leonidas argues that there are actually 2 versions of this prophecy, a prose version and a poetic version, and they probably arose at different times. The prose version might be authentic, delivered before Thermopylae. But the poetic version, the one everyone quotes? It's almost certainly a fabrication, created after the battle, possibly commissioned by Leonidas's own royal family. Why would they do this? Because Sparta lost at Thermopylae. The Greeks lost. The Persians broke through, marched south, and burned Athens to the ground. That's not a good look for the city-state that claimed to have the best warriors in Greece. But if you can turn that defeat into a mythic sacrifice, if you can say your king chose death to fulfill a divine prophecy, saving all of Greece through his martyrdom, then suddenly you haven't lost. You've won a different kind of victory. A moral victory. A heroic victory. The paper's author argues that the Delphic priests, possibly at the request of the Aegead royal family, Leonidas's bloodline, crafted this prophecy after the battle to transform catastrophe into legend. To make it seem like Leonidas had known all along that his death was necessary. Because if Leonidas died by choice, following divine will, then his death meant something. But if he died because of bad planning, political maneuvering, and betrayal, that's just tragedy. And Sparta didn't do tragedy. Sparta did glory. Here's the biggest lie in the Leonidas story, that it was 300 Spartans against the world. It wasn't. When Leonidas marched to Thermopylae, he didn't arrive with just his 300 Spartiates. According to Herodotus, the Greek force at Thermopylae included approximately 7,000 soldiers from various city-states. The Spartans were joined by 500 warriors from Tegea, 500 from Mantinia, 120 from Arcadian Orchomenos, 1,000 from the rest of Arcadia, 200 from Phlius, 80 from Mycenae, 700 from Thespi, 400 from Thebes, and 1,000 from Phocis and East Locris. And that's not even counting the Helots, Spartan slaves who served as armed attendants to the Spartan warriors. Herodotus mentions them but doesn't give us a number. Some scholars estimate there were 3 Helots for every Spartiate, which would mean 900 additional fighters that history has completely erased from the popular narrative. So we're not talking about 300 men. We're talking about 7,000, possibly more. They held the pass at Thermopylae for 3 days. The Persian army, unable to use its superior numbers in the narrow coastal passage, threw wave after wave of soldiers at the Greek phalanx and was slaughtered. The Greeks fought in tight formation, shields locked, long spears stabbing out at the lightly armored Persian infantry. For 2 full days they held. And then a Greek trader named Ephialtes, a local resident who knew the mountain paths, went to Xerxes and told him about a secret goat path that led around the Greek position. The Persians sent a force through the mountains overnight. At dawn on the 3rd day, a shepherd ran into the Greek camp screaming that the Persians had found the path and were coming up behind them. Leonidas held a council of war. And this is where the story gets messy. According to some accounts, Leonidas ordered most of the Greek forces to retreat while he and his Spartans stayed behind to cover their withdrawal. According to others, most of the Greek contingents simply fled when they realized they were about to be surrounded, and only the Spartans, Thespians, and Thebans remained. Herodotus himself admits he isn't sure which version is true. What we do know is that approximately 1,500 soldiers stayed, 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans, who may have been held as hostages to ensure Thebes' loyalty. We also know that the Phocian contingent of 1,000 stayed to guard the mountain path, and they failed, allowing the Persians to get through. On that final day, the remaining Greeks marched out of the narrow pass and into the open field, fighting in formation until Leonidas was killed. The Spartans fought desperately to recover his body, driving the Persians back 4 times before finally retreating to a small hill called Kolonos. There, surrounded on all sides, they made their last stand. When their spears broke, they fought with swords. When their swords broke, they fought with their bare hands and teeth. The Persians didn't even try to fight them in close combat anymore. They just stood back and shot arrows until every single Greek soldier was dead. While we're setting the record straight, we need to talk about the Thespians. 700 men from the city of Thespi stayed with Leonidas on that final day. 700. That's more than double the number of Spartans. And unlike the Spartans, who had a whole cultural mythology about never retreating, the Thespians had no obligation to stay. According to Herodotus, when Leonidas dismissed the other Greek forces and told them to flee south while they still could, the Thespians refused to leave. Their general, Demophilus, reportedly told Leonidas something like, "We will not abandon you. We came to fight beside you, and we will die beside you." And they did. Every single one of them. But when's the last time you saw a movie about the 700 Thespians? When's the last time you saw statues erected in their honor, their sacrifice commemorated in epic poetry and video games and comic books? There is a monument to the Thespians at Thermopylae, erected alongside the more famous monument to Leonidas. It depicts a symbolic young man with wings, representing their sacrifice. The inscription reads, "In memory of the 700 Thespians who fought and fell here, having never abandoned their Spartan allies." But the monument wasn't built until 1997, 25 centuries after the battle. 41 years after they put up the Leonidas statue. 700 men died for the same cause, showed the same courage, made the same choice. But history forgot them because they weren't Spartan. Because their city didn't have Sparta's propaganda machine. Because they didn't fit the narrative of the ultimate warrior culture choosing death over dishonor. The Thespians died anonymous. The Spartans died immortal. That's not because of what they did on the battlefield. It's because of what Sparta did afterward with the story. After Thermopylae, something remarkable happened. Sparta lost the battle but won the information war. The poet Simonides of Samos was commissioned to write epitaphs for the Greek dead. The most famous one, inscribed on a monument at Thermopylae, reads, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say, "Go tell the Greeks." It doesn't mention the Thespians, the Thebans, the Helots, or anyone else who died there. It says, "the Spartans." It makes the battle about Spartan obedience to Spartan law, erasing the sacrifices of everyone else. This wasn't an accident. This was propaganda. Sparta needed Thermopylae to mean something specific. They needed it to prove that Spartan warriors were superior to all others. That Spartan discipline, Spartan training, Spartan culture produced men who would rather die than retreat. That the agoge, the brutal system that traumatized boys for 14 years, was necessary and noble. So they constructed a myth. They emphasized the 300 Spartiates and downplayed the other 7,000 soldiers. They promoted the oracle's prophecy as proof of divine destiny. They turned Leonidas from a middle-aged king leading a holding action into a warrior philosopher choosing death to save civilization itself. And it worked. By the time Herodotus was writing his histories, compiled in the decades after the battle, the Thermopylae mythology was already solidified. The 300 Spartans were the heroes. Everyone else was supporting cast. This myth served Sparta well for centuries. Even as their power declined, even as they made disastrous political decisions and eventually became a second-rate power, they could point to Thermopylae and say, "Remember when we were the greatest warriors who ever lived?" But the myth also trapped them. It created impossible expectations. Every subsequent generation of Spartan soldiers had to live up to the legend of Leonidas and the 300. Any retreat, any compromise, any practical military decision became a betrayal of their ancestors. The myth of Thermopylae didn't just celebrate Spartan culture. It calcified it, turning flexibility into weakness and pragmatism into cowardice. Sparta's inability to adapt, to evolve beyond the militaristic culture that had once made them powerful, eventually destroyed them. The myth they created to immortalize their greatest moment became the anchor that drowned their future. So here's what we've learned. The battle wasn't 300 against 1,000,000. It was 7,000 against perhaps 200,000. Leonidas wasn't a young warrior in his prime. He was 60 years old, a reluctant king who'd spent most of his life as an afterthought. The oracle's prophecy might have been fabricated after his death. His decision to stay at Thermopylae might not have been about honor. It might have been about politics, about covering a retreat, about buying time for a larger Greek force to assemble. Does this make Leonidas less heroic? It makes him more human. And somehow, that's even more powerful. Because think about what he actually did. Not what the myth says he did, but what the historical evidence suggests. Leonidas was given an impossible task by his own government. Take a token force to a strategic location, hold off an empire, and don't embarrass Sparta in the process. He was essentially told to perform a miracle with 300 men while the rest of Sparta stayed home for a religious festival. He could have refused. He could have argued. He could have pointed out how insane this plan was. But he was in his 60s. He'd waited his entire life to become king. He'd seen his brothers die or self-destruct. He knew that kings who didn't follow orders didn't stay kings for long. So he went. And when he got to Thermopylae, he did something clever. He gathered every Greek soldier he could find. He turned his suicide mission into an actual defensive position. He used the narrow pass to neutralize the Persian numbers advantage. He organized 7,000 men from a dozen different city-states into a coherent fighting force and held one of the most strategic positions in Greece for 3 days. That's not mythology. That's military genius. And then, when the Persians found the mountain path and his position became untenable, he made a decision. He sent most of his army south to regroup and fight another day. He kept a rearguard, Spartans who legally couldn't retreat, Thespians who chose not to retreat, Thebans who were being held as hostages, and used their deaths to buy time. He turned a political stunt into a tactical victory. Because of those 3 days, the Athenian navy had time to prepare. The Greek city-states had time to evacuate their citizens. The Persian supply lines were stretched thin. A year later, the Greeks defeated the Persians at the naval battle of Salamis and the land battle of Plataea. Persia never again attempted to conquer Greece. Would that have happened without Thermopylae? Maybe. Probably. The Athenian navy and the Greek coalition were formidable. But Thermopylae gave them something intangible. Proof that the Persians could bleed. Proof that overwhelming numbers didn't guarantee victory. Proof that determined defenders could hold against impossible odds. That's what Leonidas gave Greece. Not a miracle. Not a divine sacrifice. Just 3 days. 3 days bought with blood and bone and strategic brilliance. I started this video by saying history lied to you about Leonidas. But that's not quite right, is it? History didn't lie. Sparta did. They took a complicated, messy, deeply human story and sanded off all the edges until it became a perfect jewel of propaganda. They erased the other soldiers. They erased the politics. They erased the doubt, the fear, the desperate improvisation. They turned a 60-year-old man making the best of a bad situation into an ageless warrior embracing destiny. They turned a holding action into a mythic last stand. They turned a tactical retreat into an act of cosmic significance. And for 2,000 years, we believed them. We wanted to believe them. Because the myth gave us something the truth couldn't. A simple story about courage, about sacrifice, about knowing when to stand and fight even when you know you'll lose. We needed heroes. So we created them. But here's the thing. The truth is better. The truth is that a middle-aged king who never expected to rule, who spent his childhood being beaten and starved in the name of military excellence, who watched his brothers destroy themselves fighting over power, this man was handed an impossible mission designed to look good politically while accomplishing nothing militarily. And he said yes. He took his 300 men and 7,000 allies and held a mountain pass for 3 days against an empire. He used strategy, discipline, and sheer bloody-minded determination to inflict devastating casualties on an army that outnumbered him 30-1. He bought time for Greece to survive. And when the end came, when betrayal and geography made his position untenable, He didn't abandon his post. He sent others to safety. He stayed with the men who couldn't or wouldn't leave. He fought until he fell, and his soldiers fought over his body 4 times before retreating to die on a hill. That's not the action of a man following a divine prophecy. That's the action of a man who understands duty, who values the lives of his soldiers, who knows that someone has to pay the price for time. That's not mythology. That's leadership. And the 700 Thespians who refused to leave him? Who chose to die beside people they'd known for 3 days rather than return home safely? Who have been almost completely erased from popular history despite making the same sacrifice? Their story is better too, because they didn't have centuries of cultural conditioning telling them that retreat was shameful. They didn't have a mythology demanding they choose death over dishonor. They just saw people they respected making a stand, and they decided that was where they wanted to be. That's not obedience to law. That's not cultural programming. That's choice. Pure, voluntary human choice. And that's what makes it matter. So why does the myth persist? Why do we keep telling the story of the 300 Spartans instead of the 7,000 Greeks? Why does Leonidas's face appear on gym walls and tactical gear and motivational posters, usually accompanied by some quote about how pain is weakness leaving the body? Because myths aren't really about what happened. They're about what we wish had happened. What we need to believe can happen. The myth of Thermopylae tells us that a small group of determined people can hold back overwhelming force. That sacrifice means something. That courage exists. That there are causes worth dying for. And those things are true. They just weren't true in the way the myth suggests. Leonidas didn't know he was saving Western civilization. He was trying to survive a political nightmare while keeping his soldiers alive as long as possible. The Spartans weren't superhuman warriors choosing death over dishonor. They were products of a brutal training system who legally couldn't retreat. The 300 weren't alone. They were part of a 7,000-man coalition that history forgot. But they still stood. They still fought. They still held. And maybe that's the real lesson of Thermopylae. Not that heroes choose death over dishonor, but that ordinary people, complicated, flawed, politically compromised, scared people, can still do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Leonidas wasn't a superhero. He was a 60-year-old bureaucrat with a messed-up childhood who got handed an impossible job and somehow pulled it off anyway. The Spartans weren't an elite warrior race. They were traumatized children turned into soldiers who followed orders because that's what they'd been trained to do since age 7. The Thespians weren't legendary heroes. They were farmers and tradespeople who made a choice in a moment of crisis and paid for it with their lives. That's the real story. That's the truth history tried to bury under 2 millennia of propaganda and statues and epic poetry. And somehow, knowing that makes the story even better. Because if Leonidas was just a man, not a demigod, not a warrior king, just a man doing his best in a terrible situation, then maybe we can be Leonidas too. Not by seeking out glorious deaths, but by standing our ground when it matters. By protecting the people who depend on us. By buying time for others to escape. By making the best of impossible situations. By being human in the face of overwhelming odds. That's what Leonidas really gave us. Not a myth about Spartan supremacy. A reminder that courage isn't about being fearless or invincible. It's about showing up when you're terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. About being 60 years old and taking 300 men against an empire because someone has to. About staying when everyone else leaves because someone has to. About fighting for 3 days and dying on the 4th because someone has to. Not because a prophecy said so. not because you were destined for glory, but because in that moment, in that place, you were the only one who could. The statue at Thermopylae shows Leonidas as a young warrior, muscled and fierce, spear raised toward an enemy only he can see. It's based on a myth. The real Leonidas was older, scarred, probably exhausted. He'd lived a complicated life in a complicated city during complicated times. But he's still standing there. 25 centuries later, still standing at that pass. Not because he was perfect, because he was there. And so were 7,000 others. Most of whom we don't remember. Most of whom history tried to forget. But they were there too. Go tell the Greeks, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their duties, not to Sparta's laws, but to each other, they lie. That's the story history lied about. But it's the story that actually happened. And somehow, it's more than enough.